Hi everyone. Now we are going to go over the study guide for the lecture quiz or exam on the heart and circulatory system. So this is like another lecture exam. It'll be 50 points, and for the Monday, Wednesday classes, we have more time in lab, so I'll be giving this during the lab period, most likely right at the beginning, and there will be also some Scantron answers, or the bubble card answers. And so the questions will have to do with these topics on the study guide. So right here we have chapter 18, part A, and remember there's the two parts of the study of the PowerPoint scripts. There's part A and part B. So the very first objective here is going to deal with the role of pericardial fluid and the pericardial sac. So if you remember, completely surrounding the heart, there's a fibrous pericardium, and then there's an inner two-layer pericardium that has the visceral layer tightly clinging to the heart, and then a little thin layer of fluid, pericardial fluid, and then the visceral layer outside of that. Now this pericardium is deep to another layer called the fibrous pericardium. Now, pericardial sac is very important. It limits the amount of fluid that can be in the heart. It supports the heart, etc. But the most important function of the pericardial sac is that it contains this fluid which will prevent friction development as the heart beats, because it's moving as the muscle contracts and as the ventricles squeeze the blood out. It's really important to have prevention of friction. So trace the blood flow through the heart, naming the chambers, valves, and vessels that it passes through. And then number 3, be able to trace a drop of blood anywhere in the body, and then also be able to define the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. So 2 and 3, both of these actually deal with picking a place in the body, such as the left big toe, and then tracing a drop of blood all the way back up to the heart. This is what my circulatory system wrap, I'm a little blood drop. It actually achieves both of these objectives, other than just simply describing pulmonary circuit and systemic circuit, which I will remind you of. But anyway, if you take a drop of blood in the left big toe and it's just given up the oxygen to the tissues there, it returns through those capillary beds to venules, those are just little tiny veins, to the major veins, inferior vena cava, to the right atrium. And then from the right atrium, remember, it passes the right atrioventricular valve, which is called the tricuspid valve, into the right ventricle. Then it is pushed out of the right ventricle through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, to the pulmonary arteries, to smaller pulmonary arterioles, and then to the bed in the capillaries in the lungs around the alveoli, where this carbon dioxide leaves the blood into the air that you're going to end up breathing out, and then oxygen is diffusing into the blood at this area, and then from the capillary blood in the lungs, that blood will then go to little venules, to the pulmonary veins, and then it returns to the left atrium through the bicuspid valve. That's the atrioventricular valve on the left. The bicuspid valve is also called the mitral valve. It goes to the left ventricle, and then it is squeezed out through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta, the big giant major artery that's bringing blood out to the body tissues. Then the blood will flow into all of the major arteries. To get back to the left big toe, it will then go down the aorta all the way. It will pass into into the left common iliac artery to the left external artery, the left femoral artery, etc. But just be able to say that it goes through the arteries, goes to smaller arterioles, and then breaks back into the capillary beds in that location. And this blood is actually bringing oxygen to the tissues and picking up carbon dioxide. So we're back where we started from. Just watch that wrap a couple times. That'll cover all of it. There's also a really good animation from McGraw-Hill Publishing that shows blood flow through the heart. So what is the pulmonary circuit? Pulmonary circuit is when blood is pumped from the right ventricle to the lungs, and then it will return back to the left atrium. The systemic circuit is when blood goes from the left ventricle out into the aorta to the body and then returns to the right atrium. So remember, pulmonary means lungs and systemic means the rest of the body, out throughout the entire body. Okay, so now we have traced the blood flow during coronary circulation. I'll give you bonus points for this one. I will most likely do this on the lab practical, and I will show you a very short little PowerPoint presentation that shows you a couple of mnemonics for how to remember a few of the coronary arteries and then the coronary veins. So this will not be on the exam. It will be on the, I'll give you an opportunity to answer this on the lab practical, which is in March. Okay, now we're on part B of chapter 18. Describe the components of the conducting system of or in the heart. It's also called the cardiac conducting system or the conducting system in the heart. And this has to do with the electrical conduction, the flow of the action potentials or the depolarization, which is like the electricity that goes to muscles. Now, with the heart muscle, remember, it doesn't need a direct neuromuscular junction in order for the muscle to contract. But within the heart, remember the sinoatrial node, and then the flow of electricity, basically the action potential goes out to the atria to stimulate the atria to contract. And then you have it go to the atrioventricular node, and it goes down the atrioventricular bundle, or the bundle of His, straight down in the middle of the heart from the atrial septum or interatrial septum down into the interventricular or ventricular septum, branches into the left and right bundle branches, and all the way down to the apex or the point of the heart, and then it shoots up throughout the ventricles in what we call subendocardial conducting network or Purkinje fibers. And this is how the flow of the stimulation of to the heart muscles occurs. And remember, the upper chambers, the atria, contract together, followed by both ventricles contracting together. This is also traced out in an EKG or an ECG, and I believe, yeah, that will be coming up very quickly. But keep in mind too that as far as innervation of the heart, there are sympathetic and parasympathetic nerve fibers that synapse on the heart that will influence how quickly the heart muscle contracts, how quickly your heartbeat. I'm doing air quotes for that one. But anyway, sympathetic nerve fibers speed up the rate of the heart, and parasympathetic fibers keep it slower, because parasympathetic is at rest. Sympathetic nervous system is when the body is alerted or threatened, or when you're doing exercise. Number 6, define bradycardia. Bradycardia, this is a slow heart rate. Tachycardia, a very fast heart rate. Fibrillation is can be dangerous if it's ventricular fibrillation. It actually can be dangerous even if it's atrial fibrillation. Fibrillation is when the heart muscle cells are not contracting at the same time. So with atrial fibrillation, you have an irregular kind of a heartbeat where some muscle fibers are contracting and others are not. This can lead to clots within the atria that could, of course, eventually break off, and they could go somewhere like to the brain to cause a stroke, or enter one of the coronary arteries and block the blood supply to the heart muscle or to the lungs. It just depends on what branch a clot ends up going into. Ventricular fibrillation is life-threatening, and sometimes they say that the ventricles appear to be like a bag of worms, where the ventricles are just like making kind of a really irregular kind of contraction, where parts of it will contract and other parts are not, and that is a medical emergency. Okay, the cardiac action potential. This is, there's a handout or a diagram right in your module. So I have put into the module for this unit a diagram that actually shows you the cardiac action potential tracing. Be able to identify the depolarization, the plateau, because remember there's that absolute refractory period of the cardiac action potential due to calcium ions coming into the heart that keeps it depolarized so that you can't have a tetanic or prolonged contraction of the heart. And then, of course, when it goes back down, we call that repolarization. Okay, now the ECG or EKG, as I mentioned before, this is actually a reflection of the cardiac conduction system in the heart. So that when the SA node, sinoatrial node, fires, it sends out that signal to the atria, and then it goes down to the atrioventricular node, shoots down the ventricular septum, and then will flow throughout the ventricles to depolarize the ventricle cells, and as a result, then the ventricles will contract. What this is showing is a reflection of the electrical activity with the cardiac conduction system of the heart. Remember the P wave, that is atrial depolarization. The QRS complex represents ventricular depolarization, and the T wave is ventricular repolarization. Anything that gets depolarized will repolarize. So the atria, they will be repolarizing during the period of the QRS complex, so it's somewhat hidden. So this is all explained, and there's figures in your PowerPoint. Alrighty, now we're up to number 9. Understand the events and the sequence of the cardiac cycle. There's also a sheet in your module, and just print these sheets out. They're like one-page sheets. This is a summary. It's nothing more than what we've gone over in the PowerPoints and in the other objectives in the study guide. It's a summary, and it goes through all of the events that are going on throughout one complete cardiac cycle, meaning when the atria are depolarized and then they contract, and then the ventricles are depolarized and they contract. Ultimately, when the ventricles contract, it's squeezing out the blood, and that's the whole point of the heart, as a pump. Okay, preload and afterload and stroke volume. Now, this can be quite complex. You can see that all of these concepts, they were studied throughout the lifetimes of many scientists and physicians. Dr. Frank and Dr. Starling devoted their lives to studying this and describing it, so it's kind of difficult to give every single detail in such a short period of time. But in a nutshell, preload is basically the stretch of the cardiac muscle fibers just before the contraction of the heart, and we're pretty much the most interested in the stretch of the muscle fibers in the ventricles. So when there's more blood returning to the heart, comes into the atria and then goes down to the ventricles, it will actually stretch those muscle fibers even more, and that's going to result in a larger stroke volume. Afterload is the pressure against which the ventricles must pump blood. So if you have high systemic blood pressure, hypertension, and there's a lot of pressure in those arteries, it's going to create a resistance against a stroke volume coming into those vessels. So it actually makes the ventricles work harder when afterload is increased. So that will tend to decrease the volume of blood that is leaving the heart. And this is named after Dr. Frank and Dr. Starling. Sometimes it's just called the Starling law of the heart, after Dr. Starling. Okay, and there we go. Number 20 is the Frank Starling law of the heart, and it's all related. They pretty much talked primarily about preload and the stretch of the muscle fibers. There is an ideal amount at which muscle fibers are stretched, where they can stretch the most effectively. This is also summarized on a handout in your book, and it talks about cardiac output, which is the rate, the heart rate. That means how many times the heart contracts or beats per minute times the stroke volume. And I believe that one's coming up pretty soon. Okay, number 21, that's this right here. There is a handout posted in Canvas. Print that one out too. It's just a little diagram. It's a nice simple summary of factors that influence cardiac output. And it actually shows when the arrows go up to the left side of the phrase. Actually, I have it right here. Let me just show you this figure right here. There it is. So you can see cardiac output, CO, equals stroke volume times heart rate. And these arrows mean increase. These arrows here are meaning leading to. So what's this one? This would be increasing stroke volume, increasing heart rate. So the plasma noradrenaline, this is similar, it's a very, very similar chemical to adrenaline. Adrenaline is the same thing as epinephrine. We just use those terms pretty much interchangeably. And norepinephrine would be noradrenaline. Regardless, both of these are associated with the sympathetic nervous system, and this will increase heart rate and stroke volume. So let's look over to the left. You can see increased plasma noradrenaline increases stroke volume, and it also will lead to increase in heart rate, thus increasing cardiac output. Increased action even of the sympathetic nerves to the heart. And there are those sympathetic nerve fibers that innervate the heart, and this will serve to increase stroke volume and increase heart rate. So during exercise, sympathetic nervous system is active, and this is going to greatly influence cardiac output. Okay, and it shows over here. Let's go on down here. Over here, it's showing you on the right that decreased action of parasympathetic nerves to the heart will also increase heart rate. So remember, parasympathetic innervation of the heart slows the heart rate. So if we decrease the action of parasympathetic nerves, it will ultimately increase the heart rate. Now, this is showing you things that can increase or decrease heart rate. So over here is the affecting heart rate. Age. So babies actually have a faster heart rate, and then as people get older, it becomes slower. Sex, meaning male or female. Females typically have a faster heart rate than males, or the activity of sex will increase heart rate because it's an exercise. Body temperature, when body temperature goes up, like during a fever, this will increase heart rate. Electrolyte balance can really influence heart rate, and that would be ions like potassium, sodium that are in the extracellular environment. So that can, especially potassium, can really influence the heart. Too much potassium or too little potassium can actually stop the heart. Potassium, remember, is the K+. Physical condition. If you're in really good physical condition, that will decrease your heart rate, because an exercise athletic heart actually has a much slower resting heart rate. It can pump more effectively, so it doesn't have to pump as many times per minute to deliver a certain cardiac output, because the stroke volume will be bigger. If you're in poor physical condition, typically heart rate will be faster. It needs to go faster in order to deliver a given volume of blood, because you may not have as good of a stroke volume. Other hormones like thyroxine, noradrenaline, those, particularly thyroxine, that one actually can affect heart rate. High thyroid levels will increase heart rate and blood pressure. So let's go look over here. These are the factors that influence heart rate. How many times the heart beats per minute? Over here is stroke volume. So we already saw that plasma noradrenaline or adrenaline in the bloodstream, and the action of sympathetic nerves to the heart increase stroke volume. And here it's showing you, as more blood returns to the heart, an increased volume of blood comes back to the atria. The atrial pressure goes up. This delivers a higher volume of blood to the ventricles, increasing intraventricular pressure, meaning within the ventricles. This increases end diastolic ventricular volume. That means how much volume of blood just before the ventricles contract. That will, an increased end diastolic ventricular volume increases stroke volume. Also, when you take a deep breath, this will actually decrease intrathoracic pressure, basically sucking more of that blood back to the heart. And so that's why sometimes too, when you take a breath, it will alter your deep breath, it'll alter your heart rate. But anyway, by decreasing intrathoracic pressure, it's going to increase end diastolic ventricular volume, thereby increasing stroke volume. And that is the end. I'm going to minimize this. So we went through the cardiac output and described the factors that increase or decrease cardiac output. This is also in a figure that is like an illustration in your Part B of Chapter 18. Okay, now we're up to Chapter 19. Classify blood vessels based on structure and function. In other words, define an artery, an arteriole, capillary, venules, and veins. Now with the arteries, you have the big, huge arteries. Those are considered elastic, like the aorta. They're very stretchy because they can contain a large volume of blood. Then you get to the muscular arteries that they have lots of smooth muscle in their tunica media in the middle layer. And so the arteries get smaller and smaller. Our arteries typically have a lot of smooth muscle, even in the arterioles. Arterioles are just tiny arteries, and these will lead to little tiny microscopic vessels we call capillaries. At the capillary level, this is where oxygen will diffuse out from the bloodstream to get to the living body cells, and carbon dioxide will diffuse into the blood at the site of these capillaries or capillary beds. Then blood will collect into little teeny venules. These will bring the blood into veins, and that goes into larger and larger veins. Of course, from the upper limbs and the head, all that blood will come to the superior vena cava. Then from the trunk and the lower limbs, all of that blood eventually gets to inferior vena cava, and this all goes back to which chamber in the heart? Yes, the right atrium. So the differences, the major differences that I want you to remember are between veins and arteries. The arteries, this is the answer. Arteries have thicker walls than veins and contain smooth muscle. This smooth muscle allows arteries to dilate, and that means open up to allow more blood flow, or constrict. When they constrict, it limits the blood flow to certain areas so that that volume of blood will be available to go where it's needed in the body. Veins have much thinner walls than arteries, but they do have valves on the inside. Valves direct the flow of blood, so they will allow blood to return to the heart. So for example, in the veins of the lower limbs, the valves allow blood to travel up towards the heart, but not to go back the other way. If a valve is incompetent, is not working correctly, that can lead to swelling of the vein distal to that valve, and that's what we call varicose veins. So these are veins and arteries, and a couple of major differences. Define and describe cardiovascular shock. Cardiovascular shock is when blood pressure plummets and there's not enough pressure in the vascular system to deliver blood to the tissues, and that is a medical emergency. And even anaphylactic shock is due to a massive allergic reaction that causes blood vessels to dilate and the blood pressure plummets, and so it's incompatible with life. Then be able to trace a drop of blood anywhere in the body. This is also covered in I'm a Little Blood Drop, and there's a link and a Word document that has the words in there, so you could follow along with the words. And if you know all of that, you will be able to answer questions related to where is blood going, naming any of the structures within the heart and the various blood vessels. This is not where I ask you to know exact names of each artery or vein, such as the jugular veins or the carotid arteries or iliac veins, etc. Excuse me. So number 26 is be able to take a blood pressure and describe factors that influence blood pressure. I'm not going to ask you about this, blood pressure. This is covered in chapter 19, but we will be doing an activity in lab, and I have a lab that I've actually written. It's after the blood typing. It's called the Human Cardiovascular Physiology Lab. You should have that in your folder somewhere. So I have actually I posted a digital copy if you can't find yours, and we'll be doing that in lab. There's also a really nice animation that's a link within this Canvas module for the quiz exam on the heart and circulatory system, chapters 18 and 19. But again, this will be as a lab activity. Have a great day. I will see you in class. Stay warm.